She's never really shown me her issue, and we wanted to see if we can kind of piece through if there's things that are visible in here. Bear with me as I play with the PowerPoint because I'm not super familiar with how to make it work. So, hey guys. Okay. Could you kill this thing? You got it? So we'll cover first just kind of the parameters that you can actually change on the bike without addressing the rider itself, and then eventually we'll get into mechanics of riding and some of the cause and effects for injury. So when it comes to fitting, 3 points of contact, you can adjust multiple components of each of the 3 contact points between the body and the bike, between the seat handlebars and pedals. I'll go over some of those kind of loosely, and I want to talk a little bit about the difference with how you set up road versus mountain bikes and the point behind the different arrangements and what we're trying to maximize. Okay, so looking specifically at the saddle, I'll just pull Tara's bike out here. You know, you always start when it comes to fit with saddle tilt is where we always begin. This thing should be level, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You can adjust height, fore aft, tilts, and then the saddle itself. We're going to talk a little bit about the actual parameters of a saddle and how to mate it to a pelvis properly, because saddles and pelvises are like shoes and feet, but it never really gets addressed as such, and it's a little harder to measure. Okay. So saddle height typically is measured from the nose of the saddle or a contact point on the saddle to the bottom bracket when measuring the actual length of it. That's going to directly affect the knee flexion angle. We usually measure the knee flexion angle either with the foot perfectly flat at the bottom or as the person's in motion, and then just take a video and you capture the knee flexion angle as they're in motion to see where they tend to gravitate towards. Different schools of thought will have different numbers that you expect. It's going to be somewhere between around 30 degrees, like high 20s to low 30s as the knee flexion angle at the bottom of the stroke. The bottom of the stroke is typically the place where it's measured because that's the most difficult place to adjust if it's off, and it's dictated completely by the rider position and their pedaling style. So next. The fore-aft position is going to be measured using the person's knee as a vertical alignment. So in this picture here, you can see they've just got a plumb bob lining right off the front of the patella, and that's dropped down. And most schools of thought are going to get the person's pelvis centered on the saddle, have them pedal a bit, and then either measure right off of the tibial tuberosity or the front of the patella or somewhere in between there, and then find its vertical relationship to the front of the crank arm. As a ballpark figure, you want to see it somewhere between the center of the spindle and the front of the crank arm itself. And there might be variation from side to side, which we'll go over when I get into a little more detail. That's going to be for cross-country mountain biking and for road biking. That is fairly consistent between the two as far as the orientation you want between the two. Between the patella and the crank arm. For time trial bikes, since the weight is pitched so much forward, you typically have quite a bit more of an overlap with the patella and the front of the crank arm. You're looking for more like 5 centimeters plus of distance between the front of the person's patella and the front of the crank arm when measured at 3 and 9 o'clock. Now, we'll get into more depth in a bit. I want to talk a little bit about saddles and kind of point out how they vary from brand to brand and what you're really looking for when it comes to proper saddle fit. If a saddle is correct for you, there's not a lot of reason for it to be anywhere except essentially flat. If you tend to ride your saddle with it highly nose down or highly nose up, there's some other mechanical factor that is not being addressed properly, and you're fixing it the wrong way. Each saddle is going to be a little different with the way you reference its level, because this is a Physique Aliante, Arione, which is extremely flat, but others are going to have more of a drop through the middle of them, an actual saddle shape. When that's the case, it's hard to find a consistent way to measure it. You have to kind of guesstimate as far as where the person's pelvis is going to be sitting on it. We'll look at the saddle that Tara's on here in a little bit. You can simply use like just a basic level when it comes to that. And feel free to jump in if there's something you want me to point out or if you want to say something.
Hey Tim, I got a question.
Yeah.
So in that picture that you had there, so it's got kind of an offset post. Is there?
So that's all going to be relative to, if you're trying to orient the person on top of the bike in relationship to the crank arm below, it doesn't really matter a whole lot what's happening right here. You're just trying to get the knee angle that is desired and the knee orientation to the pedal that's desired. You could have a 4 centimeter setback post that's back here and then have it slid all the way forward. It really wouldn't make any difference as long as it's where it needs to be. If you tend to have a saddle that is really far shifted to one end of the clamp, then you either need to change the setback angle of the seat post itself, either go to a vertical or more of a setback. A typical post is either a vertical pillar post, and then there's somewhere around like a 2 centimeter setback. There are brands that go as far as 4 centimeter setback, but it's not used a whole lot. Answer your question?
Yep.
We'll get into the kinematic factors of like the rider on top of that in a little bit and just what you're trying to accomplish. Now, okay, so the saddle itself, most people just get on a saddle and they don't really think about whether it's the right saddle for them. Now, if you take a look at the pelvis and how it mates to the saddle itself, if you hold this up on me, or Tara. I'm going to hold this model spine up onto this pelvis and just kind of look at the bony landmarks and how they attach. Because with a pelvis, the two major contact points are going to be your ischial tuberosities, right, your sits bones, and then some amount of pressure underneath your perineum. And this is showing a compression chart of where this particular rider is sitting on this saddle. And you see on this one, they've got really the majority of their pressure right underneath their perineum, which is, nobody really likes that. You're going to go numb if you're a guy, and you're just going to be in pain if you're a woman. I see a lot more women who just kind of gut through that and think that saddles hurt, but really the right saddle for you shouldn't really hurt. That's just kind of, taking the time to actually figure out the right one. If you look at this image on the right, you see much more contact underneath the ischial tuberosities on the saddle, which would correlate with, I'm going to show you here. So here's the two ischial tuberosities, and your perineum is where you really want to minimize pressure. So for this saddle, your pelvis is going to be in an orientation somewhat like this. This saddle is measured at 155 millimeters wide. It easily captures the width of this model's pelvis. If this saddle was too narrow, you would find the saddle slipping up in between the rami of the ischium here, and it would start to bear more weight on the front, and you'd end up with a pressure profile like that. So, when body geometry saddles first came out, they were really focused on alleviating pressure here, so all they did was just cut out that spot. But really it comes down to how the pelvis is lining up on the saddle in the places that it should contact. And there's different ways of doing that, which I'll show you a couple pictures of saddles in a second. I'm a huge fan of Specialized and Bontrager saddles because they make multiple shapes in multiple widths, like any shoe you find. You need the right shape for your pelvic orientation and the right width for the width of your pelvis.
So you should get measured.
You really should get measured, and that's a good place to start. I think I have a picture of the measurement tool here on the next one. So there's Specialized body geometry measurement tool. You can see you're just measuring the width between your ischial tuberosities, and that's going to measure somewhere between 130 millimeters wide to 160 millimeters wide. These things tend to have a little bit of margin of error because you have your butt cheek underneath there, and it's a fairly bulbous thing that is less like, there's not really a knife's edge to measure from. So there tends to be a little bit of sloppiness with that measurement, but it's a great place to start for sure. It is important that you actually have your pelvis oriented correctly when you sit on these things, because if you sit on it and you have your pelvis tipped back under, you're going to get a whole lot different measurement than if you have it vertical or anteriorly tilted, because you've rearranged the position of these bones. it's easy to mess that up if you have somebody sit and they just slightly orient their pelvis wrong. If somebody is used to sitting in a posterior pelvic tilt sacral sitting and they sit on one of those, you're going to send them home with a saddle that's an inch narrower than they probably need.
How do you know then if you're sitting right?
You kind of just have to have
Like
somebody
make sure your
like,
spine's straight?
yeah, make sure your spine is straight. There's actually ways, sometimes they'll have people do it like in a squatting position to kind of pull your legs up.
You'll be able to feel the difference too, right?
For sure. You know, you should be bearing the weight underneath the sits bones versus on your actual tailbone itself.
Right.
There was a note on the last slide about the seat being too soft, could aggravate.
Yeah, so typically in the past, when this was a very loose science, folks tend to always gravitate towards, okay, if my butt hurts, I need a softer saddle. That's really like, it's the equivalent of your shoes don't fit, so you wear moon boots. Like, you're just kind of diffusing the pressure around. When you have pressure right underneath your sit bone, it's a fairly tough region, and it'll accommodate the pressure within 10 rides or so. You'll toughen up there. But if you're really bearing weight spread out and it's going through a lot of the muscle of your hamstring insertion and through your glutes, that can be really irritating to the muscle itself, and you don't really ever acclimate to that. And you never acclimate to this. You might ignore it eventually, but you're still having decreased blood flow and numbness. So,
Thank you.
yeah, of course. So there's that. And the way you sit on the saddle can really dictate the kind of injuries that you might sustain or the discomfort you might have. So, okay, a few different ways of getting this done. So specialized, I think this is the toupee model, if I remember right. Can't do this one, yeah. And this saddle is a fairly level saddle. It doesn't have a large dip to the center of it. It does have a cutout for a little bit of extra perineal decompression. Comes in multiple widths, so you can capture the right pelvic orientation. Bontrager is effectively doing almost the exact same thing here with the Affinity. There's no actual cutout, but they do have a dip to it. And Alex's bike here is an Affinity women-specific model, and you can see just how they have alleviated the pressure contact through the perineum on her saddle. It's a little different than Tara's bike here, but it's the same effect overall. I tend to focus on folks not getting too carried away with what this portion of the saddle looks like, but focus more on the actual contact point. So that's where things really need to get lined up. And then you have brands like SMP, where they totally embrace pressure through the perineum. They just completely alleviate pressure through the nerves and blood vessels by just having a giant cutout there. This saddle tends to sit fairly narrow, and it ends up riding very far up into the bottom of the pelvis. So it's actually kind of in between these two bones, up in the center. So it's almost having an outwards pressure on the bones instead of a real bottom contact. You won't go numb on this, but it hurts like hell, and you kind of have to get used to it. I'm not a huge fan of it, but some people, I'm not against it. If you really want to be low with your perineum contacting it and not go numb, and you don't want to weed through the other saddles you might try, you're not going to go numb, but that doesn't feel good.
What would be the saddle position for that one on the bottom? Is there any particular?
As far as how to orient it,
Right.
leveling that is tricky because the nose drops off really heavily.
Right.
You tend to focus on, like, okay, right where the contact point is. So if you look at where, you're still going to have some contact of your ischial tuberosities here and here,
Right.
and you want that to be somewhat perpendicular to the actual contact of your body.
Right.
So it tends to look a little more nose down when you have it really effectively flat there. But there's no hard rule on it. You can tinker with it.
Right.
And there's a bunch of other ideas on how to, just like shoes. I mean, you've got barefoot running shoes, you've got giant posted shoes that are bulky, ones with springs underneath. Saddles are exactly the same thing. Very gimmicky, but unnecessary, you know? Sure. So, all right. Then you have the contact of the cockpit. So if you're looking at a road versus a mountain bike, you got two very different phenomenon. Again, with both of them, you're going to affect overall reach on the bike. You're going to affect width of the hands on the bars, and you can change position of the handlebar or the brake levers and shifters in order to change wrist position. Now, you kind of have to look at